Hello and welcome. In this video, I will be explaining what Fury Road really is and how it connects with the original trilogy of Mad Max movies. Let's begin. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome was supposed to be Miller's final entry in the franchise. He did not want to make any more of those movies. In fact, he wanted to kill Max at the very end of Beyond Thunderdome. However, he was fearing it would have been too dark, so he spared Max and let him wander the wasteland once again. But the whole world he had created for Max? That was all over. Well, not exactly. Miller decided to bring Max back in 1987, but this time around, he wanted to turn Mad Max into a TV show. The role of Max was to be reprised by an Australian actor, John Blake. Unfortunately, Blake was involved in a car accident in 1986 that left him permanently disabled, and plans for the Mad Max TV show fell through. Miller returned to this idea in 1995, where it was reported by Daily Variety that a weekly television series based on the Mad Max movies was set to blast onto TV screens in the fall of 1996. No other details have been revealed other than the show would not include human violence, but rather vehicular combat. The idea for a TV show was brewing in the minds of both Miller and Warner Brothers' domestic television distribution. Just around the same time in 1996, Miller would cross paths with the key figure responsible for creating Fury Road, Brendan McCarthy. Brendan McCarthy has been a huge Mad Max fan ever since he was a teenager. He was so into the world of Mad Max that he would send fan letters with concept art and ideas to George Miller, unfortunately without any response. When rumors of a Mad Max TV show started to brew in 1995, Brendan McCarthy was then working as a principal designer for a Canadian CGI TV show called Reboot. Being a fan of Mad Max, he even turned one of the episodes of Reboot into an obvious homage to The Road Warrior. The episode was called Bad Bob. McCarthy then sent that episode on VHS tape to George Miller with a note saying, "Whatever happened to Max?" 2 weeks later, he got a reply. George Miller wanted to meet with Brendan McCarthy in Los Angeles. And so they met, but the problem was, Miller wanted to make a Mad Max TV show. The series was supposed to be, and I quote, kind of like the Xena Warrior Princess version of Mad Max. Did he want to make a Furiosa TV show in 96? Well, we might never know, but what we do know is that Brendan McCarthy was caught off guard by this idea.
At the time, George was thinking about doing a Mad Max TV series. This was at the time of Xena and Hercules, pre-cable. I mean, very recklessly, I said, look, fuck the TV series. What about Mad Max 4?
And so he started to present a ton of ideas for a new Mad Max movie. Miller really liked those ideas, and it was then decided a new Mad Max movie has to be made, and it was going to be called Fury Road. Miller started to assemble a team of writers and storyboard artists that would help him and McCarthy create the movie, because this time around he wanted Fury Road to be a purely visual experience. Therefore, the movie had to be conceived in a visual way, in the form of 3,500 storyboards to be specific. To create them, he hired a storyboard and concept artist, Mark Sexton, who would later write the Mad Max comic books, Peter Pound, who would become the principal vehicle designer, Nicole Lathouris, Miller's longtime friend and the actor who played the rat mechanic in Mad Max 1, he became the script analyst. Miller would also briefly hire 2 additional people, Tony Wright, a concept designer, and a traditional script writer, Eric Blackney. Unfortunately, Tony Wright had to leave the project early on, leaving quite fascinating concept designs for vehicles. Blackney was hired to flesh out the script, but he couldn't grasp that Mad Max is something more than a cookie-cutter action movie. He wanted to make Max a generic action man with one-liners and no depth.
At a certain point, Brendan and I were working, and then I'd bounce across and look at the material that's coming out from this writer, and it was really bad. And I told him, look, it's just not working, it's not working. And he said, well, I think it works, And I said, well, Brendan agrees with me. And he said, and I'm sorry for the swear word, but he said, what the fuck would he know? He's just a cartoonist. And
how wrong he was.
A guillotine dropped, and Brendan and I worked for the next 2 years together, and we brought into the fold Peter Pound and Mark Sexton. Yeah. And seriously, in many ways, it was the time of our lives.
The writing would commence with Miller and McCarthy, and they wrote the first 2 acts. According to McCarthy, Miller had already had a basic outline for the movie before they even begun writing it. The idea involved the wives, there were 6 of them at first, and Max falling in love with Furiosa at the end. After writing the first 2 acts, McCarthy had to leave the project, and the 3rd act was written by Miller and Mark Sexton, who became the chief storyboard artist for the movie. The idea for Fury Road was simple. It was conceived as a continuation of the original trilogy with Mel Gibson playing Max once again, but also it was supposed to be the final Mad Max movie. The reasoning behind it was that Max would have been an old road warrior by then, but he would still be wandering the wasteland. It was time for him to go home, to fully redeem himself as a human being and return to society with a newly found love for Furiosa. Therefore, his final adventure had to be the biggest, the boldest, most action-packed, and Max's transformation into a human being had to be the most drastic. So in order to end Max's suffering and turn him into a human being again, they had to first throw him off the deep end. So they turned Max into a completely insane man the first time we see him. A completely feral animal that spent way too much time in the wasteland. To understand the scope of how damaged he was, let me just show you one of the first storyboards created for the movie. Here we see Max sitting next to his car, rocking back and forth, and he's twitching and mumbling to himself. He turns his eyes to the camera and we see that he is actually crying. This was the Max we were going to see. A complete mess, damaged beyond belief, truly haunted by his past, an animal who forgot how to speak after years of solitude, and fighting the demons in his own mind for decades. But still with his interceptor though. But that's not the same car he used to have. From my conversations with Colin Gibson, Fury Road's production designer, it was revealed to me that Max had rebuilt this interceptor from the ground up to remind himself who he really is, because after years of mental torture, he was desperate to hold on to his identity. Colin Gibson compared Max to a Japanese soldier stranded on an island years after the war had ended. At the very beginning, we see Max playing with a radio, hoping that he will hear a signal from the headquarters telling him that the war is over and that he can finally go home. Max in the early version of Fury Road was an utterly damaged man who wanted to end his suffering once and for all. A man with a very basic instinct of survival and with a plan to travel to the plains of silence so he can finally find his peace. Max would then be captured by the Necro Boys, who would later be called the War Boys, but Miller changed the name after 9/11. One of the Necro Boys, called Nux, would chain Max to his wrist to use him as a tracker on the Fury Road in the chase after Furiosa, who stole 6 wives from the Warlord, which would later be called Immortan Joe. The script was finally finished in 2001. Now, here is the most interesting bit. The original version of Fury Road, written for Mel Gibson as a sequel, was almost exactly the same as the Fury Road we got to see in 2015 with Tom Hardy. But how so, you may ask? First it was a sequel, now it's not, and it's still the same movie anyway? Correct. They're almost exactly the same, except for 2 things: the main actor and the ending. You see, Fury Road, that was about to be filmed in Namibia in 2003, was going to be the final Mad Max movie. Therefore, it had a different ending.
In the original version I wrote with George, he goes up on the platform with her because he's found her. And when I saw the film, I thought, what the hell? I was really like, and I was kind of, you know, honestly confused and annoyed and thought, what's he doing? Why is he going back out there?
But wait, why is there Tom Hardy in the first place? What happened to Mel Gibson? Why did it take 12 years to film this movie, and what happened in that time? The movie was going to be filmed in June 2003 in Namibia, but because of the Iraq War and the US dollar collapse, the movie was postponed.
The American dollar dropped about 25% against the Australian dollar, so we virtually lost a quarter of our budget in that very short time, and we couldn't get equipment that we wanted at the time, and I was moving on to Happy Feet. There was a deadline to start that because of availability of studios and so on, and so that didn't happen.
By 2005, the prospect of filming Fury Road was still on the table, with or without Mel Gibson. But by 2006, the idea of filming with Mel Gibson was out the window. Well, why? Well, because it was too late. Keep in mind that Fury Road was written for Mel Gibson as part of the original trilogy. We were going to see an old road warrior in his final adventure that would end all of the Mad Max movies. Unfortunately, 20 years after Beyond Thunderdome, that noble idea of finishing a franchise with the fourth sequel just didn't make any sense.
Well, there was a time that Mel Gibson was going to do it, and then when he hit all that turbulence in his life and time went by, it was no longer a story about an older warrior.
People have moved on. New audiences weren't even familiar with the previous Mad Max movies, so there was no point in connecting the new movie to the old ones, despite the fact that the whole thing was written as a sequel. George Miller had to choose, either release this movie as a sequel as it was intended and risk losing a lot of money, or to change the main actor and call it a reboot. After all, nobody would even know what Fury Road was originally supposed to be, right? And so Fury Road was turned from a sequel into a reboot, except the script was the same. Eventually, Heath Ledger was selected to play Max.
I'm Jim Hatfield, and this is IGN News. If Mad Max Fury Road had gone before cameras back when George Miller had originally intended, the director says it would have starred the late Heath Ledger instead of Tom Hardy. Miller told the Daily Beast, every time Heath would come through Sydney, he'd call in and we'd chat about Max. He had that same thing that Mel and Tom Hardy have, that maleness, charisma, and restless energy, which you need to play a relatively still character.
Unfortunately, Heath passed away in 2008, so the movie needed a new actor, Tom Hardy. The movie was finally announced in 2009. It was going to be filmed in Broken Hill, but thanks to the rains, the spiritual home of Mad Max started to look like a flower garden.
We were about to shoot in the outback of Australia, and massive rains came and turned the flat red earth into a flower garden, and the salt lakes into marshland, and so we had to wait another 18 months, and eventually it didn't dry out enough, so we had to go to the southwest coast of Africa.
Now, during all that time, from 2003 to 2009, Miller had been expanding on the world of Fury Road with Nicole Lathouris and Mark Sexton.
We wrote backstories for everything, not only the characters, but for every vehicle, every weapon, how the Citadel came to be, how the Immortan Joe created that sort of empire in the way that he ruled the wasteland. And we have 3 other stories, 2 of which are written. One is a novella, one is a script.
One with the backstory for Furiosa, which was called simply Furiosa, and another script about Max called The Wasteland. Originally, Furiosa's script was going to be filmed as a CGI anime along with Fury Road in 2009. Mahiro Maeda was commissioned to do concept art for that project, and there were also plans for an official Mad Max video game. But both of those projects fell through after the rains in Broken Hill. The movie was postponed again, and this time around Miller just had to completely and exclusively focus on making the movie because it was probably the last shot he would ever have at it. End result, we never got the Furiosa anime. As for the Mad Max video game, well, that's a story in itself, so be on the lookout for that video. Eventually, the movie was filmed in Namibia in 2012, and it hit the screens in 2015. After the movie came out, Miller was often asked in interviews what Fury Road really is in relation to the previous movies. Like, is it a sequel? Is it a reboot? But he wouldn't give it a straight answer. Sometimes it was a reboot. Sometimes he said it was a revisit to an old friend in his mind. On other occasions, Fury Road was set after Beyond Thunderdome.
How does this new Mad Max film relate to the previous Mad Max installments, particularly the original shot in 1979?
Well, I like to call it revisiting the world. It was kind of stepping back in time, and yet, the world had moved on so much. It's probably after the third one.
It's understandable that Miller did not want to reveal what this movie really is, because if you've watched my previous video, he likes those movies to be mythical campfire stories that could be interpreted as you wish. So Fury Road with Tom Hardy played perfectly into that. But the movie was so confusing with the young Max that crazy theories started to show up. Maybe Max is the feral kid, maybe Max is the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, or maybe it's all a dream. Honestly, I cannot blame people for thinking those things. After all, we have a 30-year-old Max in a movie written for a 50-year-old Max. He created a lot of inconsistencies in the movie, so let's have a look at those. Number 1. Max introduces himself as an ex-cop, a relic of an old civilization.
Once, I was a cop, a road warrior searching for a righteous cause.
but he's too young to be a relic of an old civilization. The whole world around him is at least 30 years into the apocalypse, and people are not even fighting for fuel anymore, they just want to survive as a species. Max is so young that he would have to be literally born into the apocalypse. I mean, he is about the same age as Furiosa or Immortan Joe's sons. Of course, if Max was 50, that would make sense. Max would have been old enough to actually work in the Force and to remember the fall of mankind because he saw it with his own eyes. Number 2, the date on Max's back. After Max is captured, a certain number is tattooed on his back. It says 12,045th day after the fall. The fall being the catastrophic event that ended the civilization, possibly a nuclear attack, as the civilization has been counting days since that event, according to the comic book. 12,045 days is roughly 32 years since the nuclear holocaust. Again, this shows that Max is too young to be in Fury Road because he's in his mid-30s. He would have been born like 3 years before the nuclear attack happened and there was no MFB after that. But if Max were about 23 when the apocalypse happened, just like it did in the original trilogy, he would have been 55 in Fury Road, which again, it all makes sense. Number 3, Max should have been as old as the Vuvolini. When the Vuvolini explained to the wives what the satellites and the TV shows were, I can't help but laugh looking at Max. Max and the Vuvolini were supposed to be the same age and come from the same world. Max should remember TV shows just like the Vuvolini, but now it would just make zero sense if Max just jumped in and started talking about the TV shows. I mean, the first things the wives would ask him would be, how come you know those things? I mean, aren't you too young to remember this? Again, if Max was 55, he would have remembered the old world because, well, he lived there. So it all would have made sense. Those are just a few inconsistencies that revealed themselves when they turned the movie from a sequel into a reboot with a young Max. But it's not like they completely left the original script unchanged and just switched the main actor. They introduced tiny changes to make Fury Road look like it's not part of the original trilogy. In fact, they wanted to place Fury Road 40 years from now instead of 40 years after 1979. To do that, they've included tiny little details in the movie. For example, Immortan Joe has parts from a Nokia phone on his armor, which is something modern, right? Some cars are fairly modern, like the Hummer. The Nissan Skyline R32 is covered in computer motherboards. One of the badges inside the Giga Horse comes from a Tesla. Oh, and by the way, there's also the main Force Patrol badge on the dashboard. Those are just the tiny little things that were added to divorce Fury Road from the original trilogy and to make it like it takes place 40 years from now. Eventually, Fury Road had to be somehow tied in with the original movies. This task was assigned to Mad Max storyboard and comic book artist, script co-creator Mark Sexton. His duty was to specifically tie in the rebooted Fury Road to the original movies, and he did it in a series of Mad Max comic books that came out along with the movie. In those comic books, Mark Sexton had created an alternative version of the timeline. According to him, Mad Max movies begin after 2010s. The nuclear holocaust in that comic book timeline happens before Mad Max 2, Mad Max Fury Road takes place after Beyond Thunderdome, and all of the Mad Max movies star Tom Hardy. So now that you know the history of Fury Road and what it really is, where does that movie fit in the timeline? Well, it's after the original trilogy, no matter how you cut it. How long after the original movies? It could be 5 years, it could be a year, or maybe it's 10 years. We don't really know, nor do I think it really matters, to be honest. All we know is that Fury Road was originally a follow-up to Beyond Thunderdome and the final installment of the Mad Max franchise. It was built like that from the ground up. It's just that somewhere down the road it was rebranded to a reboot with a new actor. It's a very curious case, this movie. You can perceive it both as a start of a new trilogy and as a sequel to the old trilogy if you squint hard enough and pretend you're looking at Mel Gibson instead of Tom Hardy. I hope that this video clears up what Fury Road really is, so next time you sit down and watch it, you can experience it in a completely new way. Now, if you liked this video, please subscribe for more, leave a like and let me know if you liked the video in the comments. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay shiny and chrome.